Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. One of my first jobs was working at a fast food place that, I'll just say, was famous for serving tacos. For what it's worth, it wasn't the worst thing, but I definitely wouldn't choose to go back. I had my share of ungrateful customers, unnecessary messes left behind by them, and so much more. But I've also had some weird customers that were memorable. We weren't often in a situation where we feared for our safety though, so I would just take a deep breath and then get ready for the next day. But there was one situation that often plays in my head when people bring up working in food. I was working the front on this day, taking orders and occasionally picking up the lobby when it was slow. We were open 24/7 and I picked up part of someone's shift, so I was going to be there till 2 in the morning. It was probably around 11 to midnight when a guy walked in. When you work overnight in fast food, you get used to the clientele you see around at that time. So, it didn't really catch me off guard at first when the guy looked a bit disheveled. He was a tall, average-built looking guy with thinning hair and a scruffy beard. He was wearing a dark hoodie and some pretty dirty sweatpants, but he was keeping his hands in his pockets. When he entered, he seemed like he was surveying the lobby, so between that and him keeping his hands hidden, it did kind of put me on guard. We had never been robbed before, but we did go through training on how to handle them if one were to occur. I was hoping that I was just being way too judgmental, and I still greeted him with a smile. I asked what I could get for him, and he just stared at the menu with his eyes glazed over. I kept looking around the area, in a worst-case scenario kind of way, to determine my escape routes or possibly weapons. I backed up a bit, trying to play it off like I was looking for something, when the guy finally spoke in a soft, calm voice. "I'm not gonna hurt you." After that, I definitely felt stupid. I felt bad for assuming this guy's intentions, and I tried to play it off like I was cool though. I said with a bit of a laugh something like, "What? Oh, nah, you're fine, man. I was just looking for the broom. Just let me know if you have any questions, okay? No rush." He didn't look down at me or move his eyes at all. He just continued to stare at the menu. I walked up to the side, bringing the broom to at least back up my story. When I came back, he talked a bit more in the same solemn tone that he had before. "I actually do have a question, or more so a favor." Yeah man, sure, what's up?" "Can you call the cops for me?" I didn't know what to say at this point, so I just stared for a minute and he kept talking, still looking up. He said, "I'm still not going to hurt you. I'm going to need a cop." I went to walk away to grab a phone and tell one of the others that worked there when he called me back over saying, "Hey, wait. I would like to order first before you call. You guys make the best quesadillas." Not really knowing what else to do other than what he asked, I then placed his order and he pulled out a wad of cash from his pocket with a shaking hand. I actually told him not to worry about it, and he thanked me and put it back in his pocket. He then walked over to a nearby table and sat down as he looked down at the table. After his order was done, I brought it over to him and he told me that I could go ahead and call the cops now, and then he began to eat his food. I then walked to the back and called the cops. That was a confusing call and they didn't seem to take me seriously at first either. I told them the only thing that I knew. I explained the guy's demeanor, what he looked like, and said that he seemed unarmed but asked me to call the cops and I had no idea why. They said that they would send a unit out though. And at this point, I had already told the two other people working that night what was going on, and one of them overheard part of it. We all stayed in the back trying to come up with things in our head as to why he may have done this too. When the cops did finally show up, the man stood up, threw away his trash, and before walking towards the cops, he walked back over to me, and for the first time that night, he looked me in the eyes, shook my hand, and thanked me. He then walked over to the cops and they walked out of the building. We all thought that it was weird, but just left it at that as nothing else happened. Well, that is until about an hour later, we had a different cop come in wanting to ask us more questions. He was asking very specifically what all the guys said and did, and if we even knew which way he came from. I didn't see him pull up or what he was driving, but there were no cars in the parking lot that night other than our own, so he could have walked there. All I remember was that he did not exist prior to opening the door, so I don't think we were much help. He then left again and heard nothing else of it. Well, it wasn't until a few days later when there was a story on TV that caught my attention. They were making light of it and mentioned something about murder making you hungry, or something to that effect. Anyways, they had mentioned that a man turned himself in after bludgeoning his father to death, but not before he stopped for dinner. I looked up more information on it and got some more clarification, but it certainly didn't make me feel any better about the situation. It showed the mugshot of the guy, which confirmed that it was the same one that came in that night. It was reported that he turned himself in after he had beaten his dad to death that night. He said that he knew he had to turn himself in, but he hadn't eaten and wanted one last meal of his choice. And based on the area that they listed for when this took place, this man probably walked about 4 miles to get to my exact store. I assumed he walked because again there were no cars in the parking lot. I just thought to myself, why? Why us? Why our store? But I guess he said that he did enjoy the food and our location would have been the closest one to him. The thought that I was talking to a man and gave him a free meal just hours after he killed someone terrified me and made me feel awful. Well, to be honest, it gave me mixed feelings. I was terrified and my first thought was that my first reaction that night was warranted. This guy could have easily hurt me too, but he didn't. But when I gave him the meal for free and when he shook my hand, he seemed genuinely thankful. And by the look in his eyes, I thought he had just one hell of a day, or maybe even life, and appreciated the generosity shown to him. I'm still not 100% sure on the details. I've looked around at different news articles, tried finding others that may have known the guy, but all I've ever found has been hearsay. I heard some people say that he was abused by his dad and just couldn't take it anymore. I heard he was using and may have snapped or hallucinated and then attacked him. I've heard some pretty wild things, but I can't say for sure. All I know is that after that experience, I appreciate life a bit more and understand just how fragile it is. This happened to me and my daughter several years ago. My daughter, Brooke, had recently gotten her permit and would come up with any reason to drive. I didn't hate it though, as she was always willing to run to the grocery store when I needed something for dinner or pick up her little brother from school, so it was definitely helpful. But being a parent, there was also that painful feeling knowing that she was growing up. But you're not here to listen to that story. Anyways, I had to run by the drugstore to pick up a prescription, and she wanted to drive, so I agreed. My husband was at my son's t-ball practice, so it was just going to be the two of us. I think this was partially to drive more, but after we left the drugstore, she said she wanted to stop by a local fast food place that had really good ice cream. She offered to buy it though, so I wasn't going to say no to free ice cream, and I agreed. We got there and decided to go in so that way she wasn't driving and trying to eat at the same time. She didn't need to already be driving with distractions anyways. We got in, placed our order, and stood towards the back waiting for them to call it out. Once we got our ice cream, we went back and sat down and enjoyed our little treat and talked about her classes, her friends, about school, and other things. I typically ate mine slower, so since she finished before me, she said she was going to use the restroom before we left the store. After she walked away, I pulled out my phone to check the time and also text my husband. But it was just about that time that a guy walked in, and I immediately got a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. He probably had an average build, completely bald, and was wearing jeans and one of those brown-style jackets. He looked right at me with his piercing look and then quickly looked back towards the counter. It gave me a shiver down my spine, and all I could think about was that I needed to run. I gripped my phone, but before I could stand up, the guy pulled out a gun and then started shouting demands. It was like the room was in slow motion as I watched people scatter and try to run out of the doors. The employees were crouching and covering their heads, all while the poor girl that rang us up stood there frozen. The guy demanded the money in the register, and she immediately started pushing buttons, trying to get it to open. As the guy was shouting at her, I looked over to see the restroom door open. My daughter could see the people trying to take cover, and she looked very confused. I tried to communicate the best that I could without talking, shaking my head and trying to motion her to go back to the restroom. I was praying she would understand and just go back in and call 911. But as she stood there just as frozen, I really couldn't blame her. And fortunately, I was within sight of the guy and he noticed me motioning to her. This caused him to approach me and then hold the weapon in my face, which made my daughter yelp, and he looked at her. I immediately spoke up, as stupid as it may have been, but I pleaded with him to leave her alone as she was my 15-year-old daughter. He then looked back at me and demanded that I give him everything that I had. I opened my purse, and as I was pulling out my wallet, he snatched it from me. After he searched it and pulled out what he wanted, he motioned for me to go outside, which then caused my daughter to start crying. And before I could react, he looked at her and said that he wasn't going to hurt me, and again told me to go. As we started walking outside, he put the weapon in his pocket but kept it close to me, as I remember feeling him press it against my side. He said he wanted me to drive him somewhere, and I said that I would. However, when I approached my van, I realized that I didn't have my keys with me. They were still on my daughter. I tried to say something, but the words weren't quite coming out. I told him that I just remembered that I didn't have my keys, and he immediately became angry. It was obvious that he thought that I was lying, and he snatched my purse from me and proceeded to dump it out onto the parking lot. And after this, he became pretty furious and began punching my car door over and over and over again. I stood there, not knowing what to do now, when we both stopped to look up. I'm sure he heard the same thing that I heard. Faint sirens in the distance. He punched my door one more time before shouting something and then running off. I watched as he ran towards another nearby building and around the back of it. And once he was out of sight, I ran back inside where a lot of people were still covering themselves. Then I heard my daughter quietly call out for me. She had gone to one of the tables near the window and was watching us, I presume. I don't think we ever hugged as tight as we did at that moment. We all stayed pretty much like that until cops showed up and told us that we were okay. The guy did not get very far whatsoever, as he tried to take someone else's car and got caught in the process. We all explained what happened and what was all taken. He had taken the few bills that I had in my wallet, 3 credit cards, and my ID, and when they caught him, he had all the cards on him still, so I got those back. I was glad to not have to replace my ID, but even more grateful that no one was hurt. Traumatized, definitely, I'm sure. But we are so grateful that the gun was never fired. It was a terrifying moment for us, but I don't let it hold me back. It's been almost a decade since this happened, and my daughter has also moved past it too. She definitely struggled for a while, not wanting to leave my side when we were in public, and had some pretty mean nightmares, but she has become a very brave young lady. However, I hope we never have to experience something like that, ever, again. This was something that happened when I was driving across the state to visit and reconnect with an old friend of mine. I was going to be driving by myself, which I had only ever done one other time. This meant that I would have to keep myself entertained as I made the 9-hour drive. I packed myself plenty of snacks and drinks so I wouldn't have to stop, which worked out for most of the trip. However, towards the tail end of my drive, I started to really crave fries. I could tell that I was going to need some more caffeine anyways, so I decided to find a quick place to eat and refuel. I stopped at a fast food chain that was popular in the Midwest to grab something to eat and a soda. It wasn't busy when I arrived, but there were a few people sitting in the lobby eating, and I saw a few workers behind the counter as well. I approached as I normally do, greeting the person at the register, but I noticed immediately that they did not look to be in a good mood. In fact, they looked pretty irritated. I hope it wasn't because of me, so I just tried to be as nice as possible. I was also working retail at that time, so I completely understood how bad some days could be working with the public. The man at the counter quickly said in a hurried manner, "What can I get you?" So I started giving my order, and when he was repeating it, he stumbled over his words and then also said the wrong item. I politely corrected it, which made him look down, and then he started jamming buttons with his finger and then loudly sighed and apologized. I giggled slightly and told him that it wasn't a big deal, and trying to be nice, I told him that I appreciate him repeating back the order for reasons just like that. It's really amazing how far a little kindness can go. He then sighed again and then told me that he was just having a bad day. I apologized. I told him that it was okay though, and that we are all allowed to have bad days. Apparently, this was enough for him to give me a quick synopsis of everything that he was dealing with, which was definitely a lot for one person, and just tried to be polite. This all was happening while I paid and stood there with my receipt for a moment. After a few minutes and our conversation winding down, he said he appreciated me listening to him rant and that he would bring my food to me so I could go sit down. I said thank you and I went and found a seat. I sat at one of those bar tables with the stools that faced towards the parking lot with my back to the counter. Enough time passed for me to text my friend to let him know where I was at, and then respond to a few other texts when the same guy brought over a tray with my food. I thanked him and he walked away, so I began enjoying my meal. I was probably about halfway through when I heard a familiar voice approach my spot from the side and said hi to me. It was the same guy. He asked if he could sit with me for a moment as he was on a break. I really didn't think it was a little weird, but I wasn't going to be there much longer, so I told him that it was fine. And that's when the guy just unloaded. He was talking about how he was stressed because his car broke down. He thought that his girlfriend was going to leave him. His parents were pressuring him about his schooling because he wasn't passing all his classes at college because he was getting burned out and didn't think he wanted to be in that field anymore. And then he topped it all off with something along the lines of, and I have to pick up shifts here because my worthless boss's kid can't be bothered to work their own damn shift. That last part he said a bit louder and looked towards the back like he was wanting to make sure that someone heard it. That was definitely all terrible things to have to deal with, and I did really feel bad for him. But in that exact moment, I had no clue what to do or say other than, "Wow, I'm so sorry." He just stared at me and let out a heavy sigh, saying, "You know what? It's alright. I at least got it off my chest, which helped me more than you know." I just told him that I'm glad I was able to help them and that everything would work out in the end. He then stood up and thanked me and then asked me for my name. Hell, I didn't even live in that state and I probably would never see him again. So I told him honestly what it was. He told me his name was, which I think was something like Mac or Mark, something like that. And then he walked to the back of the kitchen. I had a small moment at that point thinking, well, that was something. And then I went back to my meal, preparing to call my friend when I left to tell them about it. I was just about finished, but I was distracted doing something on my phone when I heard someone from behind me shouting, which startled me. I just heard someone shout, "Shut the fuck up!" And I turned around to see Mark, and who I assumed to be the manager, standing in the kitchen. I assumed they were the manager because they had on a different colored shirt. The manager had his hands up in a manner like he was shrugging, while Mark was throwing his hands angrily. The manager was talking a lot quieter as I could only hear Mark shouting. It's now got the attention of the others in the lobby and the two other workers on the other side of the kitchen. And after a short conversation between the two, I saw Mark grab something to his right, and before I could blink, he swung it at the manager. The next thing I remember was hearing the agonizing screams coming from the manager, while the two workers on the other side are also now yelling at Mark. I quickly got up and ran over to the counter, where I then saw the horrifying scene. Mark was now on top of the manager, swinging this hot fry basket at his face. I was frozen in place. I knew what I needed to do, which was call 911, but I couldn't move. I just stood there horrified by the situation unfolding in front of me. I finally came to my senses when one of the other employees jumped on Mark and was fighting him to get off the manager. I went back to my seat to grab my phone and then I called 911, and thankfully, they were able to get my location because I barely knew where I was. They asked me to stay there so they could talk to me, so I had to stay there even longer to wait for them. A couple other customers had run out the door, while one of them tried helping the manager by applying cold towels to their face and arms. Somehow, he was still conscious or regained consciousness. But his moans of pain, I will never forget. And to this day, they still haunt me. Meanwhile, After the other employees got him off the manager, he ran towards the back and I didn't see him again. I wanted to do something, but I was scared that he may come back out and try to do something again to all of us who were standing there with him. I just stood by the door, hoping to see the cops or an ambulance soon. And after what felt like an eternity, they did finally show up. The cops went in first and immediately went to the back. Then the EMTs came in and started caring for the manager. I then had to tell them everything that I saw, as well as everyone else that was still there. Apparently, there was another exit out back, and Mark had left through it and was long gone. Unfortunately, I wish I could tell you more about this, but that was pretty much it. After all that, I was given permission to leave. I got sick and then called my friend from my car, now shaking and crying. I explained everything to them, and when we couldn't talk anymore, I called my sister and told her. There was no way that I could finish this drive by myself with my own thoughts. I definitely needed a distraction. Thankfully, I only had about 3 hours left to go, which was enough time to get it all out, for me to calm down and then even pull over to take a quick much-needed power nap. I got to my friend's place late that night, and after a few drinks, I crashed. I was thankful that I was with good company after that, because the thoughts and sounds kept circling my mind and definitely made it hard to sleep for a few nights. I have no idea about the condition of the manager or if that Mark guy was ever caught. I just hope that both of them got the right help that they desperately needed. Oh, and if I'm ever on a road trip like that, I only do drive-through now. Hi everyone. I'm a long-time lurker in this group, but I've never posted because I've never really had anything that I thought was worth sharing. I've read a lot of stories on here, and I honestly never thought that I was going to one day make a post. Yet, here we are. Sure, we've had our share of creeps at my work, but this one was above and beyond everything else. This happened only a few weeks ago, so the memory is still fresh in my mind, and honestly, I'm still a bit creeped out about it. I was working the night shift at my McBurgers, and yes, I'm calling it that because I don't want the real restaurant to see this and try to shut me down. And it seemed like a pretty normal night. So to give some context, the McBurgers that I work at isn't in the best part of town. We've had our fair share of weird people and bizarre things happening. But honestly, it kind of feels like people with ill intentions just leave our store alone. It's almost like our McBurger is a safe haven for them, so they know not to do crazy things there. Like, we get the types that kind of look like they're going to commit a robbery, but then they just order a burger and leave. And then, wherever they go afterwards is who they hit. Well, unfortunately on this night, we got a taste of the crazy. It was around 2 a.m. and we were mostly empty. I was manning the drive-through window and doing some sweeping in the back area when we weren't getting any cars. Kevin, one of my coworkers, was manning the front, but due to the lack of traffic, he was doing some cleaning up on the line and other parts. After a bit of this, we heard the door open and Kevin wrapped up what he was doing to head to the front and then greet the customer. I watched him go up and look around and then come back, saying that there was no one there, and then just shrugging it off. He went back to cleaning, but about 5 minutes later, I looked up and I told him that he had a customer because there was a man standing up at the front. He looked a bit messed up, not dirty or anything, just a bit like he was stressing out. He was wearing a nicer button-down shirt and a decent pair of pants, but they were, for the lack of a better way to put it, messed up. Like, his shirt was halfway unbuttoned, his tie was still tied around his neck, but halfway unknotted. His pants were unbuttoned, but his belt was holding them up, and his hair looked like he had been pulling it out. He looked like a VP for a company or something that has just closed its doors for the last time, if that makes any sense to you. The man just stood there at the counter looking at nothing in particular, like he was just spacing out. Kevin asked if he could take the man's order, and the man just stared at him with that same blank expression. The man just kept his eyes focused on Kevin, not saying a word. And after a few moments of staring, and Kevin trying to get him to say anything, waving his hand in front of his face and looking back at me like, "Is this guy okay?" The guy then screams, "Hey!" straight at Kevin. He jumps and I jump, and we were both now paying full attention to this guy. At this point, our manager Sasha is actually coming out of the office room to see what exactly is going on. And as soon as she does, this man starts screaming at her, yelling that in his words, She was the one with Satan, and that she was an affront to the Holy Father. We both turned to look at her. She had a confused look on her face, and yeah, that was weird. But then, as we weren't paying attention to the guy, he reached forward and grabbed Kevin's shirt and then pulled him close. At this point, I ran up to the front to try and get this guy away from him. I was sitting there trying to push this man off, and he's sitting there staring at Kevin with his whole face shaking, and then starts saying, "They're coming, Kevin. This is the end. This is how all things end." Considering how much he was shaking aggressively, his voice was surprisingly calm and direct. He started pretty much trying to pull Kevin over the counter, and I was struggling to get this guy off of Kevin. Thankfully, Sasha was already in the back and calling the police. As I'm trying to pry the man off of Kevin, he began shouting about how they were here and that we needed to leave. Thankfully, police arrived damn near immediately, and my guess is that they were probably already patrolling and waiting for something to happen. They managed to restrain the man with the two officers and then get his hands in cuffs. As they led him away, he continued to rant about some impending doom. The whole ordeal was over in a matter of minutes, but we were all in a pretty confused state of panic. After the police left, we all tried to get back to work, and when Kevin went to clean the restrooms, he found a weird symbol that was scratched into the wall. And not the stall, but the actual paint on the drywall. The only way I can describe it is, it's like a summoning circle for the supernatural. Obviously, we have no idea why he carved it into the wall before going psycho on Kevin. But at least, we knew what he was doing between the time that he walked in and we saw him. Obviously, this left us all a bit shaken, but we went back to just doing our mundane jobs until our shifts were over. Kevin did end up putting his 2 weeks in not too long after, and he just had his last shift. He said that he didn't really want to quit, but he keeps getting this weird feeling that the guy is going to come back, and it's bothering him enough to leave. I get it. I don't blame him. It was definitely a terrifying moment. And the fact that this guy paid way more attention to Kevin probably didn't help. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. I would also like to give some extra love to my Patreon members, my channel members, and also my tippers. Thank you so much. If you would like to extend a little bit more support for the channel, don't forget to leave a like and a comment down below. If you would like to become a Patreon member, a channel member, a tipper, or even to buy merch, check out the links in the description below. Again, thank you. And I hope you stay scared because your fear feeds me.